policy. We're going to be talking about leapfrogging or levelling up, how you can drive place-based growth. I'm Emma Palmer-Foster. I'm a PhD student here at Birkbeck and really pleased to welcome you all, and also to welcome three speakers who've got a lot to say about place-based growth, and it should be a very interesting debate. First of all, we've got Dr. Jonathan Potter from the OECD. He'll be followed in his talk by Dr. Enrico Vanino from the University of Sheffield. And finally, we're going to have Jacadi Nicholas from the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. And that's one of the government departments into which BASE has been split following recent governmental changes, the most recent governmental changes. What we're going to be talking about today is regions and place and how we can drive growth in the regions. As I mentioned previously, all three of our participants have something unique to say about place-based growth, regional growth. And hopefully in our discussions, they can give some insights into policy levers that might result. Jonathan Potter is going to discuss stickiness in entrepreneurial behaviour in regions and how that persists in the long run, but then occasionally that pattern's broken by areas which have sudden changes in performance, and those are known as leapfroggers or plungers. Enrico is going to look at growth pathways and how those can drive industrial policy and innovation policy, and how that can improve the performance of lagging regions. Many of you will remember Jacadi Nicholas and her discussion of R&D typologies in regions from a couple of years ago. That was a really interesting debate when she discussed places and their R&D types and how you can promote growth. She's done a lot of work in the government on R&D as it relates to place and R&D as it relates to levelling up. So we've got a great panel to discuss the question here today. How the session's going to work: John's going to talk for about 10 minutes, Enrico is going to do the same for about 10 minutes, and then Jacadi, as discussant, is going to compare and contrast their views through the lens of her experience, which is about harnessing the characteristics of regions, and then we're going to have some Q&A. So while you're listening, do put forward your Q&A in the chat. I think there's just a chat. I don't know whether there's a Q&A button, but do put forward your Q&A, and we look forward to a really interesting debate. And we're going to start with John now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So my talk is about leapfrogging and plunging in the performance of regions in their league table ranking within their countries, the improvers and the decliners, the regions that get more entrepreneurial measured by the startup rate, and the regions that get less entrepreneurial. And the main focus of the paper is the United States, with comparisons made with European countries. So I'm head of entrepreneurship policy in the Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities in the OECD. So this, of course, is an OECD project, and it's a project that's been looking at long run, 90 to 100 years, medium run, 60, 30 years, changes in the regional league table of entrepreneurship performance. In the USA, as I said, new analysis has been done, completely new analysis in the USA. And then we've made comparisons with existing work that's already available in West Germany, published by Fritz and Kublina, and in England and Wales, that's been published by Fotopoulos and Story. So we've been able to make comparisons of the USA with those two countries based on pre-published material. The authors are there on the slide, and the publication is due out very soon. It'll be an OECD SME and entrepreneurship paper available on the OECD iLibrary. Now, the rationale for the study is that there's established evidence that there are wide regional variations in entrepreneurship performance within OECD countries. That is basically saying that leveling up is important. Excuse me. Yeah, okay, so point one is that there's established evidence that there are wide regional variations in entrepreneurship performance. And we've got an OECD paper going back to 1993 about this, and it's showing that in OECD countries, the business startup rate is 3 to 4 times higher in the highest region than the lowest region within the country. So that means that there's an entrepreneurship performance gap. There's foregone entrepreneurship. That's why leveling up is important. Now, what's interesting about this paper is that we are deepening the evidence. There's new evidence from those two countries, England and Wales and West Germany, that the performance of regions is very sticky, is very persistent over the years. It means that the regions that are top of the ranking in terms of their startup rate 90 years ago are still top of the ranking now. And the same for the bottom of the ranking. It changes little over time. So there's regional path dependence. The two research questions of this project are first, is it just a feature of Europe? This persistence in regional entrepreneurship rates, or does it extend to what is seen to be the archetypal entrepreneurial economy, the United States? The second question is, the research question we had, some regions we know buck the trend. Some we can call leapfroggers, or we could call plungers. Well, what are the reasons for the changes in those regions, and what are the lessons for leveling up? Now, what we believe we're doing here is responding to a problem with the entrepreneurial ecosystems work that's in place, which is largely what we call cross-sectional. It's not longitudinal. What we mean is that it's looking at one point in time. It's looking now at the current characteristics of the top performing entrepreneurial ecosystems and trying to sort of clone them and suggest to other regions that they need those features. And we argue that this isn't satisfactory because, of course, the top regions have got a whole set. Every pillar is strong in those regions. So it won't tell you a single factor that you can influence in a lagging region. And secondly, weak regions may be different to the more successful regions. So the point is that just looking at top regions isn't good enough, but also today's characteristics in the top regions, they might not have been the cause. They might be the consequence of other factors that happened a long time ago. You've got good access to finance, you've got a strong entrepreneurial culture. That's not necessarily the cause. If you want to identify the cause, you need to look at the long term and what's been happening, what's causing the leapfrogging and the plunging. So what we did was we got together this set of data here. We have long period correlations in the three countries for self-employment rates for the long period, because that's what's available over the long period in different geographical units, commuting zones, MSAs, labour market areas, local authority districts. In the shorter period, 1970 plus, we can look at startup rates as well as self-employment rates. And there are other metrics that could be used as well, like impactful or innovative startups. As the time period gets shorter, the findings, the first thing is that there's a striking persistence in the self-employment rankings of regions over the 1970 to 2019 period in the USA. In the commuting zones, 0.52. The startup rankings in the commuting zones over that sort of 50-year period, 0.73. But again, some regions experience considerable change, improvement, or deterioration in their position. 30-year leapfroggers were diverse. You've got large cities, but you've also got small towns in rural areas. The plungers concentrated in the American heartland, but few large cities, few tourist destinations, few innovation hubs. We did regressions on what explains the rank mobility, things like self-employment, like home ownership, like foreign-born population. And here, this slide compares the countries, and it's showing that there is strong persistence in the self-employment rates and in the startup rates in all of the countries. So persistence is a real issue. Do the same factors explain leapfroggers in the USA and Europe? There are some variables that were significant in all studies. The self-employment rate had a negative impact. Human capital level, home ownership level, size of foreign-born population all had a positive impact in all of the countries. Some variables like wages, manufacturing share, population density, important in 2 of the 3 countries. One thing being different, that the regional industrial diversity was a driver in the UK, but not in the other 2. And finally, the policy implications of all of this. The first implication is that it is important to improve the performance of low entrepreneurship regions, we think. That there is this foregone opportunity for the regions themselves and for the national economy. But the policy measures that are needed, they can't be just the national policy tools like the interest rate or like taxation or like simplifying regulation for business startups, because they don't vary across the country. We need to get down to what are the region-specific factors. Another point is that regional entrepreneurship policy needs to be in it for the long term, because some of these factors are taking decades to play out. It's possible that there are some policy levers that can be identified in the shorter term, but it's not a quick fix, regional entrepreneurship. The solution we see is to explore in more detail the leapfroggers and the plungers and what's been causing their changes. And the final point is to say that clarity is needed on the metric of entrepreneurship that policy is targeting, and whether entrepreneurship should be measured by self-employment, by startup. It leads to different regional league tables. And so policymakers need to be clear what they are aiming to improve. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thank you. If anybody's got questions for Jonathan, do start to put them in the chat. And now we're going to move on to Enrico Vanino from the University of Sheffield. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start my presentation. Okay, so starting from Jonathan's point, today I would like to discuss a little bit more why do we observe this path dependence in entrepreneurship across regions, what are the consequences of this for leveling up, in particular for regional inequalities in the UK, and what can be done as well in order to break this path dependence, especially in lagging behind regions. So we all know that productivity is, of course, one of the main drivers of economic growth and long-term economic performance of countries and regions, driving capital accumulation, wages, knowledge intensity, and so on and so forth. The UK has still a long-standing productivity gap, not just with its major competitors, but as well it is characterized by very large spatial disparities, both across and within nations and regions. In fact, this is a problem not only just confined to inequalities across regions, but for instance, you can see from the diagram on the left-hand side, there are huge variations as well within regions. For instance, if you consider London, we see Tower Hamlets with very high levels of productivity, but at the bottom of the productivity distribution within London, we do observe neighborhoods which are the same level of other neighborhoods, for instance, in Manchester, Birmingham, or Milton Keynes. So this very unequal productivity distribution in the country is mostly driven by London productivity, outstanding productivity as a global hub of economic activity, where instead there are plenty of regions which are lagging behind, in particular those which were mostly relying on manufacturing industries, and as a consequence, the UK has become one of the most spatially unequal countries in the OECD. So reducing regional productivity disparities would not just be useful in order to achieve higher equality within the country, but as well it could address part of the UK productivity gap vis-a-vis its competitors. But what are the drivers of these productivity differences across regions? So the previous literature has identified several potential drivers for to explain these imbalances. First of all, of course, it's human capital, with people with high skill tending to concentrate and to move to places with higher productivity, as you can see on the diagram on the right-hand side. But as well, it could be driven by investment in infrastructure or differences in institutional and governance arrangements across the country. And this is particularly important in a country like the UK, in which we have a very diverse setting of local governments, such as the devolved nations, or as well such as travel to work areas, mayoral combined authorities, and local authority districts in England. But of course, one of the main drivers as well is the composition of the local business environment. And in this case, we can distinguish between two different type of compositions. On one side, we have within industry differences in productivity, where we see differences within certain sectors, which are driven in particular by the so-called happy few firms, which are very large, very technologically intensive, more productive, internationalized, skill-intensive firms, which, as we can imagine, are mostly focused in the southeast of the country. In this sense, if we want to target this within industry inequality, probably industrial policy should focus on promoting upscaling and upskilling of lagger firms. But there are as well broad differences across regions and in the composition of sectors, of the sectoral composition of regions. Even if this is not evident at the aggregate level, as soon as we start digging a little bit farther, we do observe a lot of difference at the subsectoral level, in particular with the most productive, complex, and knowledge-intensive activities within industries which tend again to concentrate in the southeast of England. So these very large differences raise serious concerns about the design of what have been so far place-neutral industrial policy, trying to design in order to try to address exactly all sub-geographies at the same way and targeting in particular very few, very narrow high-tech sectors. So in all of that, how entrepreneurship could play a role. So, of course, the differences in economic structures across regions, which could exactly shape the possibility of the future economic development, are driven by entrepreneurship. In this sense, policy intervention could try to build on local capabilities and the comparative advantages of existing industries in order to try to enable a transition, an industrial transition or an industrial branching, promoting on one hand diversification toward higher added value and related sectors, or with industrial branching trying to expand to new sectors which are not directly related with the existing industrial structure of the region. In this sense, the industrial policy should try to leverage existing strengths rather than trying to achieve and to promote high-tech industries wherever, regardless of the knowledge base of these regions, and trying to simply recombine existing knowledge to try to support new productive trajectories in high value-added activities. But how regions could transform their economies through the growth of new business and other forms of new path development? Actually, there are tentative approaches, especially in the evolutionary economic geography, trying to describe the emergence of startups as following a path-dependent process, as Jonathan suggested before, mostly defined exactly by the relatedness between the new activities, the new startups, the new entrepreneurial activities entering the regions, and the pre-existing sectoral composition. In that sense, there are two things we need to take into consideration. First of all, path dependence between new firms and the pre-existing regional activities, but as well, it is important to take into consideration the variety of local industries. In that sense, how related these industries are to each other could be quite important, in particular in order to exactly share commonality and complementary competencies across sectors and promote in this way, for instance, startups rate in related industries, but as well unrelated varieties, so with industries which are very different from each other. This could create could have very dissimilar knowledge bases, but which could lead to less frequent, although potentially more radical, more knowledge-intensive type of processes. In that sense, based on a study that, together with the co-author, we worked on looking at the industrial compositions of regions across the UK, we did find that the entry of firms in new rooted sectors, or sectors which are already existing in the region, is usually positively defined by industrial path dependence, as Jonathan suggested before, while instead strong path dependence would reduce the entry, of course, of pioneering firms, so firms that new startups, new entrepreneurial activities, which in sectors which are new to the region. These effects, of course, are as well moderated by the industrial variety, with related varieties, so many sectors which are close to each other, reinforcing somehow these path dependence processes, in particular reinforcing the entry of new startups in rooted sectors, while unrelated varieties, by connecting more distant knowledge, would counterbalance somehow the negative effect of industrial path dependence and supporting in this way entrepreneurial activity in pioneering industries. So path renewal and path extension from this point of view can be more effective, in particular in lagging regions, in which maybe exactly the knowledge, the unrelated knowledge is not there, is not available, and could help those firms and those industries to diversify and become more resilient to possible economic crisis. So just to give you an idea of how this looks like across regions in the country, as you can see, we start from the map on the left-hand side, looking at path dependency. And in particular, if you compare it with the map to the right-hand side, which is unrelated varieties, we can observe almost an opposite distribution of these two type of learning process, entrepreneurial activities. And in fact, this is highly correlated as well. First of all, path dependence is highly correlated with startup rates, while instead unrelated varieties being highly correlated with pioneering rates. If we're zooming into a specific region, such as, like in this case in Manchester, we can try to make sense of all of this and how we can try to formulate policy implication based on this evidence. This is something I've been working on together with what was Pace until a few months ago, to try to identify paths for industrial renewal for different regions across the country. What this diagram plots basically is, first of all, we look at Rooted and pioneers industries. So rooted are industries which are already present in the region. Pioneers are brand new industries which are not there yet. Each dot represents a different industry, and the size of the circles are the comparative advantage of that industry. So how large that industry is in that specific region in respect to the rest of the country. And we plot on the horizontal axis related density, so how much each industry is related to the rest of the industrial structure of the region, while on the vertical axis we have productivity. So as you can observe in the right bottom corner, we have large industries which have a large comparative advantage, but as you can see, a very low productivity. If the region of Manchester would like to diversify towards more high added value type of activities, it could do so by moving along the diagonal, moving from the bottom right corner to the top left corner. Of course, instead, if we want to achieve startup rates in pioneering industries which are not there, as you can see, of course, the related density of those industries is much lower. They're not very related to the rest of the industrial structure, but some of them, for instance, could achieve very high productivity gains. So how can we try to break away from this existing path? How can we try to break away from path dependence? In that sense, I argue in a different publication together with colleagues about the important role of innovation policy and public R&D in trying to promote transitioning of regions towards higher productivity related industries, or even promoting diversification towards pioneering disruptive sectors. In that sense, R&D innovation policy intervention, both direct intervention and indirect intervention, could really play an important role in trying to address the usual systemic failures. First of all, conflicting incentives, for instance, between public and private sector, institutional rigidities, or even very narrow specialization in some of the regions. In a recent publication in which we try to understand the effect of national, regional, and sectoral level R&D policy, we identified that all these three levels of policies are complementary with each other, basically by targeting very different firms and industries, in particular with national level R&D policies, usually promoting radical R&D innovation by large firms and universities, while instead regional level policies, for instance, the policies carried out by the devolved nations, and the sectoral level type of policies carried out, for instance, by the Catapult network in the UK, could really instead help smaller firms, lagging behind firms, to try at least to start innovating or to start adopting new technologies rather than doing radical R&D activities. In this sense, target intervention could be quite useful in order to support growth and entrepreneurship, both along the existing paths, for instance, through innovation and tech adoption type of innovation policies, while instead with R&D investment to try to initiate diversification and industrial branching. This can be done with different policy levers, from ring-fence funding for smaller and less productive firms, innovation vouchers as well for smaller firms trying to adopt new technologies, promoting the tech-focused innovation hubs, which already exist in some of them, or for instance, even exactly funding for collaborative and radical R&D projects, which could help bring together partners from different regions. This is something that the UK does already, in particular through Innovate UK, UKRI, the Catapult networks, and so on and so forth. But there are new important policies that the government is considering. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your time. Happy to receive any question, and if you would like to read further about this, I've just listed there a few publications.
Thank you, Enrico. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. Now passing over to Jacadi, who will tell us about what she thought about the two presentations, compare and contrast, and give a view from her perspective about levelling up and driving place-based growth.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emma. And thanks both for your presentations. I have questions individually and thoughts on your individual presentations, but I think it's a good idea if I first address the leveling up element, which I think is present in both of your slides. So just for the room, I lead the R&D leveling up mission analysis in BAYS, now DSIT. which means I'm pretty close to leveling up in regards to R&D specifically. So last year I led the initial business case for the innovation accelerators, which Enrico spoke briefly about. This year is more about understanding government's readiness to meet the mission. So more work streams around sort of understanding and tracking spend, which I will just skip over for now because it's not really of interest. With that said, I think your comments on leveling up are correct in a broad sense, Jonathan. When you speak about being interested in improved sort of quality lives and bringing up those regions that are left behind and lagging is very important. Obviously, that's sort of the basis of leveling up. However, when we think about in regards to R&D and an innovation-led lens, which is a little bit different to entrepreneurship, and it'll be kind of interesting to see the different ways you define entrepreneurship and what might be relevant, because we have a few projects which might be of interest to you that we're taking forward this year. But when it comes to R&D and innovation anyway, a level of capacity is required for R&D investment to be optimized. So we have to think about the right skills, the right firms in a place, and we can't just sort of invest R&D in a place that doesn't have the basics. That's the kind of thinking at DSIT. So we would like to think that those type of regions, a different intervention is required. So for example, might need investment in roads, might be investment in local businesses before we go ahead and sort of just sort of plonk sort of innovation building or catapult in an area. We like to think of the other characteristics of the area. In general, my work has changed over the last couple of years. So the emphasis has really gone from the sort of understanding our R&D landscape to this more innovation focus. I'm sure you guys will be aware of the sort of innovation strategy which was published. It's very much a ministerial priority. In my life, we're kind of talking to the minister on a weekly basis about innovation, and especially Enrico used to talk on some of the sectorial elements of this work area, which is kind of one of the big ministerial priorities. So we're currently doing a research project to identify clusters of sectoral strengths across the country using a bottom-up approach, which may be of interest to you guys. And obviously you mentioned innovation accelerators and investment zones, Enrique, which again is the kind of direction BEIS and the whole UK government are going in. We understand that we can't use a national lens when it comes to these regional R&D policies. So the innovation accelerators, which I'm closer to because it's a DSIT-led policy area, is interested on two levels. And obviously, Enrico, you might know about this, but one, obviously, it's a place innovation support. So it targets regions that have capacity with a strong research base, with the aim of sort of accelerating the innovation in those areas. So again, not thinking about trying to bring a place from zero to hero, but thinking about those places that already have some capability and some innovation strengths. But the aim of these sort of policies is to accelerate it and bring it to the next level so that we can have, an innovation system that is dominates on a world level. The second interesting thing about it, and something that we are monitoring and evaluating, is the fact that they're actually locally led. So a lot of your presentation was about sort of understanding the capability of these places and understanding their interests and their sectoral strengths. So the innovation accelerators themselves are actually locally led. So it's a locally led partnership. So working with local government to sort of over a long process of back and forth and lots of workshops and all of those kind of fun stuff, to sort of develop a portfolio of interventions for that area. Innovation zones I'm less close to, but they're similar to it's similar to innovation accelerators, but I think the innovation zone sort of has a more of a tax lens, so there are a more sort of wider range of policies, whereas the innovation accelerator is more focused on innovation intervention. So Enrique, it would be interesting to know, I mean, you did kind of say in the presentation that you feel like the UK government has started these, but I know you had a long list of interventions that possibly it'd be interesting to know if you think we're sort of hitting the mark on these policies, or if we're still missing the mark, and where we might want to go next. I'm not sure if I should stop there. I'm not sure if you guys have any in particular comments on leveling up, and then I can go into some of the sort of wider questions that I have on your presentations.
I think you can probably ask the questions.
Yes,
ask the questions to the speakers, and then we can have some wider Q&A.
Yeah, no, I think obviously, Jonathan, really interesting piece of analysis. Is quite, when we think about stickiness and path dependency, it's usually sort of when it comes to our R&D activity lens. So hearing that is the case when it comes to entrepreneurship and innovation is interesting. Obviously the R&D lens is pretty driven by the sort of landscape and how public R&D is funded. So obviously we know, you know, the Greater Southeast, Cambridge, London, they get their funding based on the fact that they're doing well. So the better keep getting better because they keep getting more money because they're doing better. So obviously this is a problem that we're trying to unpick, not necessarily to move money or resource or excellence away from the Greater Southeast, but to just make sure that we are encouraging and promoting other regions to sort of reach those levels of growth as well. I was wondering if, I guess, you, in your analysis, you use public R&D data to test whether it was a driver of entrepreneurship in a region. And it's also interesting when we think about the stickiness and when we're talking about clusters and sectoral strengths, how they evolve over time. Because if you're saying that they're not necessarily evolving, I guess the areas of high entrepreneurship remain those areas of entrepreneurship is interesting to us in government. And for Enrique, the direct question I have for you, you mentioned sort of the fact that firms that join areas in different sectors tend to be more pioneering. I believe that's what was sort of said in our clusters identification project that I kind of touched on. We are looking at clusters that are in the same area but are experiencing different sectors or different activities. So, you know, clusters that are not necessarily based on similar activity. I guess it would be interesting for your thoughts on whether these type of clusters are likely to have more pioneering firms than that would be of a cluster with similar sectoral strengths. As that, yeah, that's just quite interesting for us here at DSIT, especially as we think about how we might support these different types of clusters. Happy to leave it there.
Thank you. I think John and Enrico can answer their questions now. Thank you. John, I think Jacadi had a question for you, which she gave.
Yeah, the question was, do we use R&D data in trying to assess the explanatory factors for regional performance in entrepreneurship, or rather in our analysis it's for the regional change in performance. So R&D spend in the region is one of the variables that we looked at, and it wasn't a strongly significant factor. You know, we mentioned the ones that were human capital. You know, that is something that's also related to innovation and knowledge, and that one did come out as something very important.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Well, I'll just tell us all to pack up and go home then, since we're
well,
we're
no,
you know, I'm just joking.
But I don't think so, because you know, it's about what we mean by entrepreneurship, which was one of the things I was trying to signal, because we've used self-employment data, you know, which is a lot of that is the one-man business, and then we've got the business startup rate, which is generic. It's any type of business. What we haven't done in this analysis is looked at knowledge intensive startups or high impact startups, and then maybe R&D spend is important.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, John. I wonder if you looked at also exploring. So I know when it comes to startups as well, startups tend to be more innovative than a usual firm. However, startups tend to fail essentially. So I wonder if there was anything you did to sort of explore that in the analysis in terms of, I guess, I know there's variables on like spin outs that have lasted or survived 5 years or things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's still about this, what was our entrepreneurship metric? And that was the number of the rate of self-employed, the share of employed, share of self-employed in employment in each year. That's the metric, or business registrations as a share of the population in a year. So another sort of useful entrepreneurship metric would be the 3-year survivors. And that would be a very good metric because that's impactful because they survive. Now, the problem for our analysis is that we have to go back 30, 60, 100 years. And all of these fancy variables that are measuring more precise aspects of entrepreneurship are available for the very recent periods, but they don't go right back. They weren't, it's not possible to get them for a long period.
That's a good point, John. I guess the last question, do you have any thoughts on how clusters of innovation activity evolve over time based on this analysis? I know it's not directly the same metrics, but I'm assuming entrepreneurship and innovation sort of, I think it was it the two heads of the same coin in the introduction?
Yeah, maybe, but not all entrepreneurship is innovative, and you can also define entrepreneurship by risk taking, rather than newness, and maybe that.
Oh, I think you've gone on to mute there, John. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, the only thing we've got is a measure of regional industrial diversity, and it came up as significant in England and Wales, but not in West Germany or the USA. But we don't know, about specific clusters and how they've developed.
One more question, Jonathan. Sorry, Enrique. I appreciate I'm coming over to you. Another interesting, I guess, I know the study was done in the US and you compared it to the UK, but in general, I think the feeling is that the US tends to have a more entrepreneurial culture than the UK. I'm not sure how that can be measured, but I wonder if there's something that you noticed or came across in your analysis. And did you do the same breakdown for the UK? Because I think that would be really cool for me to see, just because I'm a nerd. But
yeah, I mean, culture is put forward as the reason, as perhaps the fundamental reason for path dependence. When looking at this persistence and change in entrepreneurship activity in regions, the dominant argument has been that the persistence is due to the culture. The problem is then, and that is difficult to measure culture. There are some gem information data about fear of failure and things like this. That's one point. It's difficult to measure culture. It's often proxied, in fact, by the self-employment rate, which is said to give you culture. So there's a circle. There are problems with culture because it ought to be the response to entrepreneurial opportunity, maybe not itself a driver, but a lagger, the entrepreneurial culture. So we have questions, but what we would really like to identify some other policy, some real policy levers that you could use to influence levelling up.
Excellent, thank you, John. And any support you can give us, any tips would be appreciated. Enrico, I'll go to you. I'm not sure if you've remember that from all 10 minutes ago.
Yes, I do. Let me start first with a follow-up to what Jonathan said, to answer your question about exactly whether R&D policy could help supporting startups or not. As I said, we are working currently on a research project trying to look at the externalities of the catapult network, so of tech focus or industry-specific type of innovation hubs. And we do identify externalities in terms of startup rates. So it looks like exactly these technological hubs are somehow useful in order to promote startups around them, and also around clusters of catapult supported businesses. So in that case, it could be quite useful. Going back instead to the original question, yes, indeed, as you mentioned, so you have these pioneering startups, which are companies, firms that start operating in sectors which were not present in the region before. In our study, we do identify that the diversity of the industrial ecosystem in the region is really important in order to promote that startup rate in pioneering industries. So then the problem is, okay, what can we do if the region doesn't have a diversity in the industrial composition? And in that sense, we argue that, again, R&D and innovation policy could play a role in that as well. For instance, bridging companies working in different regions to cooperate with each other. And I think, for instance, about the R&D collaboration grants provided by Innovate UK and other research councils, or even, for instance, simply just introducing new technologies, introducing new activities, again, with a catapult network, with other innovation hubs type of intervention, and trying this way to promote diversity. Of course, we need to remember that exactly it will be impossible, for instance, to start, I don't know, nuclear activity or bioscience engineering in regions that have never done so. So of course, it has to be done based on the existing knowledge capabilities of each individual region. So yeah.
Thank you, Enrico. And I think that was a quite an interesting point you made on the collaboration aspect. So in the identification of the clusters, we do so. There are 3 categories that firms have to fall in. So obviously co-located, similar sectors, and then collaborating. So for that, we are using co-patents and co-published research, so using the gateway to research data. I wonder if you have any thoughts on other potential collaboration avenues we can explore, because it's difficult because we're not going to be able to get the data on somebody talking to someone else in another firm and that sort of stuff. But I wonder, in your analysis, was there anything that was of interest to collaboration? Because it's something we're working on trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, with the gateway to research data, it's quite useful, but at the same time, it focuses on a very narrow type of R&D collaboration, right? So mostly looking at very large firms operating with top-notch universities and so on. So, and instead, probably those firms that need this type of collaboration the most are those that are usually not targeted by UKRI or Innovate UK type of collaborative grants. So in that sense, probably it would be useful to try to look at other type of collaborations, like you said, for instance, looking at innovation hubs. Again, do they collaborate with catapults? Could catapult become a sort of bridging partner between different companies? or even looking, for instance, at regional type of interventions. We look in a previous paper at Invest Northern Ireland support for R&D, and they do as well, on top of innovation vouchers, they do as well small grants, and those are are doing a much better job at trying to target smaller firms than, for instance, what is done by big national level type of R&D grants. And in that sense, exactly, complementarities here are quite useful and important in order to use different policy levers to try to target different needs.
Excellent, thank you, Enrico. I'm not sure if you want to pass to the audience to ask any questions now.
Yep.
I do have another question, but I will save it because I can see we are running out of time.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. I was just going to make to the point actually that Enrico and Jacadi were just talking about the gateway to research data. Quite a lot of the life sciences companies that I work with always applying for Innovate UK and other grants and very keen when they get them. One of the things that means that the gateway to research data doesn't capture everything is a lot of companies that might collaborate with less sophisticated organizations, less sophisticated universities, just don't have the grant writing skills. So they might be trying to collaborate and do just as good work as leading universities and leading companies, but if they're less good at grant writing, then they also don't get funded. So then, of course, they are not in that gateway to research cohort. So that's just an observation.
That's a good point, Emma, and I think, yeah, very much aware of it's sort of like a bad cycle, right?
Yes,
the people that get the grants, get the money, then they have the capacity to hire people to write more grants. So it's something that UKRI are working on, especially with their sort of leveling up agenda in terms of building the capacity across regions to get that support with some of the admin side of this that might go.
Well, it's an observation I also make from chairing an NIHR panel, is that most grants that get funded are led by leading university. They've got technology transfer departments that can write grants. Anyway, that's my observation. We do have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm going to read this one out from Fumi Kitagawa. The current UK innovation policy seems to have renewed focus in universities in local R&D as well as skills, but more diverse models. But maybe a more diverse model is needed, and any international observations from national system perspectives. Have I read that appropriately? So we've got renewed focus on universities in local R&D as well as skills, but are diverse models needed, more diverse models needed, or any international observations that can be brought to the UK?
Yeah, I would see this one as being about the broad shift internationally that's definitely there, away from, we've all heard it, the linear based R&D driven view of innovation, and so it's widely recognised that R&D spending is not enough. Possibly ironic then that the EU has got this 3% of GDP target for R&D because it's not R&D spend that is the thing that's going to develop the regions, and particularly different regions have got different needs. So Enrico's got some solutions and Jacadi's got some solutions. But it's not just R&D, is it?
Enrico, any thoughts on that?
I think that exactly, probably we don't need to look at international observations or examples. We had, I guess, a quite useful type of system, which was the RDAs back in before 2011, which were working quite well. And there are some evidence that they were doing a very good job in trying to promote innovation and catch up in some of the lagging behind regions. So maybe exactly going more into that direction could be helpful. And another thing, going back to what Jacadi was saying before, yeah, the system is heavily skewed towards, and what Emma was saying as well, it's skewed towards competition, right? So the best grant is the best application is going to win, and all the rest basically have nothing to do. Probably we have to start thinking about helping also those which are not as good in writing grants, and to, I mean, I'm not saying that we should, I don't know, replace grants led by University of Cambridge with and grants led by smaller, less technologically intensive universities, but let's promote innovation adoption, technology adoption, even in smaller firms and in more peripheral areas.
Good, thank you. We've got a question here from Helen Norton-Smith. She's interested in the complementary policies which both Enrico and Jacadi mentioned, and she's asking, this is quite a tricky question to answer, do they just coexist, or is there any attempt by bodies to work together more at the government level to bring the complementary policies together? Enrico, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, from my experience, it looks like there is some complementarity at between the national level and the technological focus. And as Jacadi said, there is a lot of initiative in that regard from the government, for instance, at the moment. Less, I think, with the regional and the devolved nations. They seem to operate somehow on their own. And they seem not very much linked to the national level policy. And in fact, for instance, we were looking at whether those two different type of policy initiatives, the sectoral level and the regional level, help firms to apply, for instance, and get UKRI grants. It seems the case for sectoral for the sectoral support, but not for the regional level. And this is quite important, especially if we want to exactly support the devolved nation to try to exactly promote economic growth in their own localities.
Okay, John, any thoughts on that?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, then, well, I think we are just coming up to the end of the session now, so good timing there. Thank you to everybody who listened in and the questions, and also to our speakers and discussant, Jacadi, Enrico and Jonathan. Thank you very much for your insights, all really interesting. And there will be a blog related to this, so you will see your thoughts in print, on paper and in print shortly. But I think Helen would like to say something as well. Helen.
Yes, thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for the preparation that you've all done for this and giving us rich material, which we will be able to share. And thank you, Jacadi, for your comments. It's nice to have somebody involved in policy at national level with insights, and having the combination of the OECD and Enrico as an academic looking at these, and Emma as a practitioner from her professional perspective. That's a really nice combination. So thank you all very much. It's been terrific, and thank you, Ola, for organising it. So it's great. I really enjoyed it. So thank you all very much.